Hello.
Hello.
There we go.
So we are Carsten,
And I'm Craig.
and we are from Schedulicity. And today we want to talk to you about and take you on a little journey about how we create shared understanding and alignment in Schedulicity that has helped us in the last 12 months to do some pretty amazing things. Having said that, here are some numbers that, numbers come right away. So, Craig and I, we both don't really believe in top-down decision making, and so we have this mantra of we like to enable our people to do great work without really putting on the manager hat and telling them, you need to do this, you need to do this, and you need to do this. Craig?
Exactly. So what we do at Schedulicity is basically support people in any way we can. And one of the best things that's come out of this is enabling decisions to be made across the board. You know, giving people that ability, the authority to make those decisions. Of course, with that comes the responsibility that comes with decision making. But when you open it up to the floor like that, and we'll talk about this today, it really brings new ideas to the table that we probably wouldn't think of over 10 bottles of wine. So it's something that basically our culture has shifted over to this from a very traditional agile-like process that we did before to a much more team-oriented agile process that we have now. So we're excited about this. There's a big transformation that's occurred over the past, let's say, year and a half. And today we're going to walk you through that journey that occurred at Schedulicity.
Yes, and we make no disclaimers that this will work for anybody, but it worked for us. So here this number represents the percent increase in releases that we were able to do within a year. So we increased the releases by 600%, and I think right now it's even a little more. And so that has made everyone at Schedulicity really, really happy, in particular also like the people that do the work, unlike Craig and I, because their stuff gets out and can be used by our customers.
So yeah, at the business level, basically how everyone outside of product engineering sees this is now we're consistently delivering business value. Before, slower releases, longer releases, you had more in there, but that business value was kind of packaged up, and then you have to change some things after you release that code because things change over time, but we'll get to that as well. Shorter releases, sure, that's a thing. You can just kind of shorten your time span, but there's a lot more to it, and Carsten kind of led me down this path from his background and how we could do that at Schedulicity. So we'll talk about that a little bit.
So how did we do this? Well, some of it is magic, I think, and some other stuff was based on like long conversations that we had with our teams, and finally we're able to steer them in the right direction. So it's not always been a smooth ride. In the beginning, we were met with some resistance. It's like people say we've always done it this way, so there's always a little bit of reluctance to change. But over time, I think when people see results and when people see that it actually works, all of a sudden it's like, aha, it's not all just talk. So Craig can speak a little better about where he came from, since he's been with Schedulicity a little longer than I have.
Yeah, definitely. Prior to us starting to make more changes to our Agile process, and how we do Agile. Schedulicity had some challenges, right? So we had these larger releases like we talked about. We were trying to deliver all this functionality, system rewrites to get to the latest technology, things like that. And it's a really difficult mindset to change, to get people to think, well, how can we get to this greatest thing if we don't just do the greatest thing now and it takes this long? That's a huge challenge. When people start to understand it, when they start to think this way, that's when you see the magic that Carsten kind of talked about. when they start to break problems down into smaller things, before you know it, you're already on the latest platform. You're already using the HUD's technology. We have a long ways to go, but we've certainly come a long ways from where we were at.
So when I first stepped foot in the Schedulicity office, it was on my first day, I was tasked with, okay, let's do some planning. And there was one team with 19 team members. And I was like, oops, okay, so that's a fairly large team. And I initially approached them and said, well, maybe we should split this up. And it was like, nope, we've done it, and this is what we like to do. And they had some really interesting reasons. So this is how it looked like, right? And when I say interesting reasons, they always believe they need to know everything that's going on all the time. And that's why they all look like the same, because they were all the same. But that's not really how I thought it should work. And so we looked at like the challenges that they had. Like communication at Schedulicity at that point was pretty much impossible. One person talked to one person, then the other person felt like, why am I not being talked to? Am I not important? And that's really not the case, but you see the point. It's impossible to maintain communication with 19 team members to keep everyone in the loop all the time. Second, they wanted to know everything, and you never know really everything. So I think if you believe you know everything, you're kind of like deluded or delusional. So you have to live with a certain amount of uncertainty. And that was really difficult for those guys.
And to speak to this a little more discreetly, because I come from an engineering background, I love numbers, I love data. Carsten ran the numbers, thank you, Carsten. And it looks like we had 171 ways for people to connect. You can see, you don't need to see the details, but on that image up on the screen, you can see, that's 4 people and how they connect, that's 10 people, and that's 20 people. So we were actually looking at a graph that's the most complex one up there, and I'm sure other companies have even more complex graphs to represent the communications between their teams. But this really highlights, communication should have been impossible. How do you maintain that many connections actively and make sure everyone's in the loop? The last thing we want to lose is transparency. It's a core value of Schedulicity's. So how do we maintain that, but also break things down into where we can actually start to achieve the same or more in a more manageable way? And so if you want to calculate this for your teams, there is a nifty little formula up there, n times n minus 1 over 2, very easy, that you can plug in. N would be the number of people on a team, and then you'll see how many basic ways of communication they have with one another.
So what happened is like nothing, paralysis. That's what happened. So decisions were never made, people were often confused, they didn't know if they could do this or if they could do that. They just did stuff but really did not much. And this then also consequently led to that Schedulicity had hardly any releases. And the releases that we had were then plagued by hotfixes, and sometimes they went on for weeks. So it was not really a great time to be an engineer at Schedulicity.
Exactly, and also we basically, in my mind, redefined the term hotfix, where in my background it was like, okay, this is a critical thing that needs to get out ASAP, something is wrong. What happened? Oh, you start putting on other features. Let's get these label changes out with that hotfix. Let's get this functionality tweaked with this next hotfix, because those almost became our releases. Not a great scenario. Hotfixes are stressful in themselves to the team members, and they don't deliver that predictable value that we want to get out to our businesses and their consumers.
So, as I said at the beginning, however, they insisted on, we want to maintain this 19 people, one team structure. And so we played a game. And the game consisted of a bag of ping pong balls. There were some constraints around it, and you needed to get one ping pong ball from one side to the next. And they tried to play it with 19 people. I think they tried it for 20 minutes. Nothing happened. So there were some rules around this game. You cannot pass the person to the left or to the right, but nothing happened. So then, great idea, well, let's split the one big team into two. What happened is, all of a sudden it got really quiet. There were two teams then, and the ping pong ball started moving across. And then I really didn't have to say much. They kind of learned it themselves. So the one guy said, "Oh, you made your point," right? And so I'm like, okay, fine. So we have something where we can start. The result was the number 3, and we started with 3 teams. And this is then where the journey actually really began. So, but now we have 3 teams. What do? So typically, like when people do Scrum, they do time frame sprints, but then the teams really still work as teams, and then most likely very siloed, so they still don't know what's going on. And often leads to frustration, because then you also have to do, let's say you do a 2-week sprint, and you have to plan after the 2 weeks, and it goes on, and it goes on, and it goes on, and people think all we do is have meetings. So, but that's not really what we wanted to do.
We've heard that many times.
Yes.
In the past.
So we got a room. That's how it started. And we brought everybody into this room, and we started to plan together. And really that was the big change at Schedulicity.
Yes, exactly. So when we say everybody, this is basically the entire product development area of our organization. Engineers, product owners, designers, QA specialists, everybody who has that direct impact on creating the product and supporting the product from the engineering level is in this room. So we tried remote just as an aside with a few people, did not work. There's way too much collaboration. You miss out on the interpersonal communication, reading people's signs. It's just not a good way to go that we've found so far. So we bring everybody in, whether they're located in Bozeman or not, and make sure everyone's together for this time.
Yes. So, but also if you guys have questions, feel free to ask. So this is not top down.
Yes. So what do we do?
So we plan quarterly. So 4 times a year, we get together, we bring everybody in. We have some people that are not in Bozeman, we bring people in from the West Coast. We have a guy in Switzerland, a guy in Romania, and they all come to Bozeman for this 1 week. And during that week, in particular during 2 days, because we do plan for 2 days, 8 hours straight, we are all in a room and we hash it out. So how do we do this? You cannot really be unprepared when you come there. So our product owners, product managers, whatever you want to call them, they come equipped with features and stories. And so the teams sit together, they look at it, and then they start working through the problems that they see. And this goes on sometimes without problems, and sometimes there is some, you can feel it, there's some friction in the room. But instead of having to rely on Slack or HipChat, people can have face-to-face communication, and that usually solves the problem. It also shortens the way of communication, so problems can be solved rather quickly.
So how can you plan a quarter? So we'll go through the next few slides and discuss how we do that. First up, one concept that we use quite a bit is the cone of uncertainty. Show of hands, are people familiar with the cone of uncertainty? A few half hands, all right, so we'll go through it. Good, because we have another slide for this. This is an important concept that we use to convey how we think about the work that we're planning. What we don't want to fall back into is the old school style of thinking, right? And not that it's bad, but in this particular scenario, we feel like it just doesn't work. And that style of thinking we don't want to fall back into is we need a specific requirement sheet, design mock-ups, everything to be spelled out before we even start building something. No, we're trying to put those decisions into the minds of the team members, So give them that authority. So how does the cone of uncertainty work? Well, I drew this in Google Spreadsheets, so it's awesome. So at the beginning, or
so we plan the quarter. We have numerous amounts of sprints, and then we try to plan out the first 3 sprints in high detail. The reason we do this is because we bring everybody together. It also costs a little bit of money, and I think the first 6 weeks you can kind of like really have a pretty solid plan. Everything beyond that gets a little uncertain. That's the name, the cone of uncertainty. So what happens after the 3 sprints, it gets less detailed, and there is room for change. So I think that is really, really important to remember. Because if you plan out an entire quarter, and this is sprint 1, sprint 2, sprint 3, then you have no wiggle room. And then again, you have like this imaginary outcome that you want, but within 3 months, something can fundamentally change. And you need to be able, as a business, you need to be able to react to it.
And you don't want to lose that nimble factor either. So the need to pivot sometimes when an opportunity comes up, or any sort of changes outside of your control, those happen. And the likelihood that they'll happen kind of increases over time just because of time itself. Hopefully, within the first half of the sprint, let's say the first half of the quarter, you don't have too many of those changes. You can't guarantee that, but hopefully that's the case. If it is the case, everything's pretty clear about what the team members are working on. So this is important. Later on, getting closer to the end of the quarter, things can change. Even the stuff that you had planned out. Maybe there's a new version of Angular. Of course there's a new version of Angular. There's always a new version of Angular. So maybe we do have to shift some things around. Good thing we didn't plan for Angular 4 because we want to go 5, 6, 15, whatever. So this is where this cone of uncertainty comes in. It truly applies to pretty much everything. When you stop and think about it, it could apply to what you had for lunch today. You were pretty sure you were going to have a veggie sandwich for lunch, and sure enough, you got your veggie sandwich. What are you going to have in 3 months? I probably want a veggie sandwich. Well, it's Montana, so it's probably going to be snowing. Maybe I want some soup. I'll make the decision later, but I know I'm going to narrow it down now to veggie sandwich or soup, probably. So this kind of idea is pretty simple. Once it clicks, beforehand, it's really tough to transition for a lot of people. And that's because you want to know, especially in engineering, what you're building. It's like, well, I could commit to this, but I don't know if I can truly do that in, a number of weeks down the quarter. Well, let's just give it our best shot and see where that takes us. And it turns out that actually works out really well. But you definitely have to change people's mindsets to think like this. Otherwise, it's kind of stressful thinking, I just committed to something that I haven't fully fleshed out. Especially when you talk to like DBAs and people that have very low-level responsibilities.
So, and this is the theory that I like, or the metaphor is like steering versus aiming. If you have a bow and arrow and you release the arrow, there is nothing you can do anymore. The arrow just goes a certain direction. Whereas if you steer, you can adjust. And so if you go back to this cone of uncertainty, the first 6 weeks, you have a pretty solid understanding, and everything afterwards becomes less rigid, and you have the opportunity to change. And sometimes, and we had to do it 2 times last year, we had to pivot, and thankfully we did not plan it out so rigidly, so we could. And those 2 pivots, well, one was really successful, the other one still a pivot in the work.
So there's an awesome quote from Dwight D. Eisenhower, former president, that Carsten kind of brings with him in his arsenal when he goes around and talks to people about this stuff. And it's that plans are useless, but planning is essential. And when I first heard it, I was like, okay, sounds good. Let's keep moving on. But after time, it kind of sinks in that plans are similar to the old way I mentioned. Plans are the things that, we have to stick to this thing. No, not so much. But the act of planning, so when I think of plans, I think of something almost tangible, like physical, that, I could read. But planning implants it into people's heads. It's much different. That's what's key to this, that's one thing I should say that's key to this small planning that we do, is getting getting people to talk about exactly what we're doing. What are we trying to do here? Bringing up the shared understanding, getting people on the same page. This is much more important in a lot of ways than coming up with a plan for something to do.
So how many of you actually work on long-term plans that you have? Somebody tells you, okay, in a year we gotta have this. And how does that make you feel? You're not on camera, so you can say it. Shitty, all right. So it made us feel the same way when we did it differently. So I think you should have an idea. So therefore, our product owners, they present a vision of where we would like to go in a quarter. Everybody gets to hear it. There are no secrets. And then once we have the vision, and then you get the user stories and the features, these are just things you do to help you realize that vision. But to say nowadays, I don't know, anybody working in software can say, okay, in 9 months we have this, I think that's fairly unrealistic. And so instead, change the way you do things. Give yourself some play. Plan what you can control, and everything that's beyond your control, well, plan it out, but not as rigid. Again, I make a disclaimer, it might not work for you, but it worked really good for us. So when we do the planning in the room, at the end of day one, every team that's in the room reads out their plan to the rest of the group. So again, that creates transparency, shared understanding, and it also enables teams to say, oh, well, but if you do this here, really we should not be doing it here, we need to start it sooner, and so you also remove dependencies. Right?
Is there a question?
How are your teams by function?
No. So when I first started at Schedulicity, I had this great idea that I learned that we have T-shaped people, whereas this axis represents deep expertise, and then this broad knowledge. It's almost like a full stack developer, right? So, but then Craig and I started talking about it, and so we have teams now that can essentially do everything that's happening at Schedulicity, because instead of having only T-shaped people, we're looking at having T-shaped teams. So whatever work product comes up with, we can hand it to a team and they can essentially do it. So that's also a big change that occurred. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, do those teams typically own various features because they built them, or you try to always
That's something we're currently basically in a transition phase, because before, or I should say currently, right today how it works is they don't particularly own that. There's not an assumption that if something breaks that team will take care of it, or if we have new functionality built on top that team would be responsible for that. But what we are trying to do is enable the teams to become even closer with their work. So yeah, in general, we are shooting to enable the teams to own different things, but that's not something specifically that we've done over time. And so we'll try things, we'll see if it works, and if it doesn't, we'll try something new.
But you can see the benefit also, right? Instead of like, okay, I have this piece of work and now I need to know, and we are still fairly small. We have like 4 teams now, but one is not a product team as we call them. But then you always have to take the work and figure out which team can actually do it. If anything on that team changed, maybe then they can't do it anymore. So what's the point? So I think it's a way better solution to build teams that can actually handle the work that's at the company. Instead of like siloing teams into like, okay, back end, the API, and then the front end. I don't think that makes much sense.
And that is where we came from, just to paint the picture a little bit more. So if we had this talk last year, it would have been more about busting up silos, trying to get people out of their, not necessarily comfort zone, but they feel a lot like they have a lot going on in there. And so when you kind of bust down these silos a little bit, they feel a lot less pressure. This is good for people. So this is one way we enable people to do great work in Schedulicity, is try to make them so they're more comfortable doing their work. Silos is something that we've dealt with in the past. We still have that. I don't think it doesn't exist anywhere, but it's very manageable at this point, and I think people are pretty comfortable.
And the other thing worth noting is that like during those team readouts, our senior leadership is also present, so they hear exactly what's coming. So if anything that they envision for this quarter, they don't hear, then they can ask questions. And since this is happening on day 1 of planning, then people can adjust and we can make changes still. But we have done numerous plannings now, and like it has so far not happened. So because Craig and I also make a pretty good effort of like keeping leadership informed of what's going on. But anyways, the point is that there are no secrets. So everything that the teams are doing, everybody knows about it, and if there's things they don't agree with, then they have a forum where they can voice their concerns.
Exactly, and that goes behind this next slide here about limiting surprises. The last thing you want in a company that's trying to be hyper-transparent as much as it can be is surprises, because then people feel like they're in the dark, a decision was made that affects them directly. What planning is all about is making sure that there's no chance you can miss this stuff. You know, you'd have to fall asleep, which doesn't happen in planning, although I wouldn't be surprised if it did in some places. It's a long process. Initially, there was a strong transition, or there was a long transition, as far as people trying to adapt how they work to this new style of just, understanding how everyone else is thinking about something. Before, if you're just reading a ticket in Jira or Trello or whatever you use, you got your interpretation, you're good to go, right? But then when you build something, it's different, and that's not always good. Sometimes it can be, but most of the time, that becomes one of these surprises.
Yeah, and I've had a life before Schedulicity, and so we have done this what we call small room planning. They called it like big room planning. We have done it with like 400 people in one room, and it worked. So there's also a dude, if you want to look him up, his name is Henry Nieberg. He did it with Lego, for example. These things do work. I mean, they're not without challenges, but they are successful. So another thing that we do is then, so we have our head of product and Craig and I and our product owners. At the end of day 1 of planning, we walk around and look at the boards just to make sure we didn't miss anything, even though we did the readouts. If we uncover anything, then we can talk to the POs that are there, and then on day 2 of planning, they could bring any changes that we might think are necessary back to the teams. Again, it's all out in the open.
And I was going to mention, it is a very interactive process. So you see us kind of bounce around up here. This is what planning is like. You're kind of moving around. The data analytics team is doing something like this. Let's go check out, talk to them, look at their boards, understand. We're encouraging people to move around quite a bit to really build up a lot of energy, honestly. If you just sit at the table, like if you all wanted to stand up and walk around, I wouldn't take offense right now because we're used to this. At planning, that was a transition for people. When we had the first planning meeting at Schedulicity, the room was entirely too small. It smelled like an old locker room at the end of the day, and people just sat there. And so trying to get people to move around, that was our big first challenge. Fortunately, Carsten has an arsenal of ways to get people to start doing this stuff. And so as we employed these things, so initially planning was something they were uncertain about. What is this going to mean? How do we do this? We haven't done this before. You're expecting me to be comfortable with uncertainty, stuff like that. Now we're at the point I can clearly and honestly say where people truly look forward to our planning time. Not just because it's a break from the normal day-to-day, but because it's an activity that really brings everyone together in an interactive way. It does really break up the year, though, in this quarterly fashion, which is another benefit. You get some event, basically, where people can look forward to that camaraderie that they don't get otherwise when you're just working on day-to-day things.
The only drawback that there is with planning 4 times a week, so we do 2 days of like strictly planning, and then either we do like bug fixes, a bugathon, or we had innovation week following this. So the only restriction that we put on our people is like 4 times a year for 1 week, you cannot take vacation. But I think that's okay. And nobody has screamed and left the building yet. All right. So then also at the very end of day 2, when the plans that we have are fairly solid, when planning is almost complete, we do something with everyone that is called roam the risks. So everybody gets some time to think about, okay, the current planning that we laid out, what inherent risks does it bear? Is there something that we didn't talk about? Is there something that we're not aware of? Because everybody has some great ideas. And so what we basically do, we draw a big square, we divide it in 4 parts, and then ROAM stands for resolved, owned, accepted, mitigated. And then people think about the risks that they see for what we have laid out, and they put it in those categories. So again, it's like everybody gets a voice to say, well, I think this is probably not going to work. And once we use sticky notes, right? And so once all the things are on the board, then we look at, all right, can we resolve this during this exercise? Yes, then it gets put into resolved. If it can't be resolved, somebody willing to own it, right? Somebody takes ownership of this and tries to work with it so that it's not actually a risk anymore. Accepting simply means, well, we live with it. There's nothing we can do about it. And mitigated is, maybe there's a different way of working, so it's no longer a risk.
I wish I had brought a picture of when we did, our own risk exercises at Schedulicity. What you'd see is that, a bunch of these risks do fall in the accepted column. And the accepted is just like, nothing we can do about that. And that's okay, because at least everyone has had their voice to say, hey, this is a concern I have about the work that we just talked about, that we're committing to work on. And I want to make sure everyone knows this is something that needs to be taken into consideration, or this could derail us completely. And when people know that ahead of time, it changes everything. It really does. It changes how people decide how they're going to work on things. It changes how people approach working on the things and with the people that they're working. They get more ideas from others. It's just one way that we can enable people to make the decisions comfortably.
And at the very, very end of planning, sometimes we do a confidence vote. So now you know every team's plan, everybody has heard it. It's basically a fist of 5. So 0, you have no confidence that this works. 5, you have all the confidence. And those votes are again done in public, and everybody gets to see. And usually the conversation then happens if you have somebody that has no confidence, or somebody that has a high confidence. So between those two people, then usually a conversation sparks. Chinese. So, does that make sense?
Does do they vote like within their teams? Like is it a team-based vote, or is it like everybody in the group is saying they have a 5 confidence that the entire quarter's all worked out?
Yeah.
So like I do my team, what are you voting on exactly?
It's for the entire thing, because everybody should know we can still do it because we're relatively small, should know what's going to happen. When we do with larger organizations, sometimes they vote for their own team, but often I've also seen it that they still do it and it's not 400 people working because there's 400 people in the building, but not all the people do the work. There's also managers and senior leadership, but the people still do it that way. And it's just a very visible sign, so that it shows okay, this could actually work. Or if you get only zeros, well, I think you have a problem.
Yeah, for sure. By that time, the end of the second day, do you find you have a lot of zeros, or has the buy-in been pretty solid for the previous couple of days, and so you find that zeros are pretty null and void?
Not often zeros. I don't think I can recount that we had one. But we had, the threshold is 3. Sometimes we had 2s, and then you need to figure out what the issue actually is. And it takes a little bit of practice too, because not everybody is really comfortable. Like the voting is probably okay, but then if you need to have the conversation, and as I said, if you have managers in the room, sometimes it gets people are not as open as they probably should be. There you go.
And that basically sums up how we've gone all the way from, planning during sprints, pretty much every week, up to this quarterly planning strategy that we use now. And we continue to iterate and try new things all the time. I think we're finally to the point where people aren't just saying, why are you guys changing things again? It's not necessarily that we're changing things, it's that we're asking you to try something different. At this point, people are pretty, like I mentioned before, they're pretty excited about this within our company. I don't know if it would work anywhere. I see the light now, so I feel like it could probably work in a lot of different places. And certainly, if you do take anything from this talk today, some of these components can be taken by themselves, and you can try things at your own company if you'd like. Some of the Roam the Risks is a great exercise. It certainly is one way to connect better team members and give them that voice to say, hey, I think this is risky. I think this is something that's a little sketch. So maybe we should address it, or at least talk about it and get the risk out there. Because the last thing we want is a risk buried down to where it has no visibility until we get past and into the problem. Saved it. All right. So with that said,
shamelessly, we're also hiring. And then these are the dudes that you can contact. And questions?